There are things a man does in this life that he can't take back, and there are things he does that he'd give everything to undo. But every once in a long while, a man does the one thing that's right. Not because it benefits him, not because anyone's watching, just because the world in that one moment asks him to. I was in Cordera, Arizona territory in the autumn of 1886 when I watched a man named Wade Caro spend his last $12 buying a woman off the church steps. $12. The price of a mule's shoes and a night in a bed. That was all it cost to purchase Della Vane, a girl of 22, auctioned on the steps of the First Baptist Church of Cordera to settle a dead man's debt. And that moment, that quiet transaction on a dry October morning, that was the last decent thing Wade Caro would do before the world cracked open and pulled him back inside. Because what Della begged him for next, when the deed was done and the dust had settled, it wasn't her own freedom. She wasn't asking for herself at all. What she asked of that man broke something in him that had already been broken once before. And some things can only break so many times. If you know what it means to be asked to walk back into a fire you barely escaped, partner, then saddle up and ride close tonight. Like and subscribe if the old stories mean something to you, and drop a comment below. Where are you listening from tonight? What time is it where you are? Now let's go back to that October morning in Cordera, Arizona. And let me tell you everything that happened. The town of Cordera sat in the shadow of the Rincon Mountains like a man sitting under a debt he can't repay. 3 saloons, 1 church, 1 courthouse, and a freight office that belonged, one way or another, to a man named Royce Bidwell. The streets were packed red clay, cracked down the middle like a dry riverbed, and the cottonwoods along the main road had gone amber and gold, the way they do in October in the territory. It was the kind of morning that looked beautiful, if you didn't know what was about to happen on the church steps. Della Vane had known what was about to happen for 3 days. Her father, Thomas Vane, had died of a fever in September, leaving behind 40 acres of good bottomland, a mule, 2 hens, and $900 in debt to Royce Bidwell's freight operation. Thomas had borrowed against future harvests that never came, the kind of slow ruin that ground a lot of good men down in the territory. Bidwell's papers, drawn up by Bidwell's own lawyer and signed by a judge who owed Bidwell $2,000 of his own, stated plainly that if the debt went unpaid, the holder had the legal right to indenture the debtor's dependents as contracted workers until every cent was settled. In plain English, that meant Della and her 12-year-old sister Junie belonged to Royce Bidwell from the moment Thomas Vane drew his last breath. Bidwell was not a man who looked like what he was. Broad-shouldered, clean-shaved, a gray wool coat with brass buttons, even in the heat. He had a careful smile that never quite reached his eyes, and he spoke to everyone in the same measured, unhurried voice, the kind of voice that makes promises sound like facts and threats sound like simple observations about the weather. He owned the freight wagons that moved goods up from Tucson, the faro tables in the Silver Notch Saloon, and a road camp up the Rincon Wash where he kept a crew of indentured workers digging a spur road for the coming railroad. 7 men on his payroll carried guns. He had a legal paper for every wrong thing he'd ever done. His enforcers were brothers. Cutter Foss, the elder, was long-boned and quiet. Not the friendly kind of quiet. The kind that makes horses shift their weight and dogs tuck their tails without any clear reason for it. Denny Foss was younger and broader, with a laugh like a barking dog and a cruelty he wore easy, the way some men wear a good hat. They'd ridden with Bidwell 5 years. Neither had seen the inside of a jail cell. The judge in Cordera saw to that personally. On the morning of October the 4th, Della stood on those church steps in her dead mother's gray dress, the best one she owned, while Bidwell read the terms of the indenture aloud to a crowd of maybe 30 people. Most of them looked at the ground. A preacher stood to one side with his hat in his hands and said nothing at all. Junie had been taken up to the road camp 2 days before on the pretext that the paperwork was already processed. Bidwell had promised Della he'd release the girl the moment the debt was settled. Della didn't believe him, but she had no cards left to play. The auction lasted 4 minutes. Bidwell opened the bidding at $10. Nobody spoke. He lowered it to $8. Still nothing. Just that particular silence of a crowd that knows what's happening and won't stop it. Then a voice came from the back, easy and unhurried. 12. Nobody had noticed the man come in. He was sitting on the top rail of the livery fence across the street, one boot propped on the lower rail, holding something in his hand that might have been coffee. Lean, dark-complexioned, maybe 32, with a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in a week, and eyes the color of old ash under a dead campfire. Canvas duster the color of the land itself. Hat pulled low enough that you had to look twice to find his face. He didn't look like much. That was something he'd spent years cultivating. His name, the name he was using, was Wade Caro. The name he'd been given before that, the name the territory had hung on him during 4 years of hard circuit riding out of Yuma, was the Ash Marshal. But in Cordera in October of 1886, nobody knew him from any other tired drifter with $12 and no particular place to be. Bidwell looked at him with that careful smile. "Sold," he said. Just like that. Wade crossed the street and laid the coins in Bidwell's palm, every cent he had, and took the folded indenture paper that Bidwell's lawyer shoved at him. He didn't look at it. He looked at Della. She watched him the way a trapped animal watches someone approach a snare, with that combination of desperate hope and deep distrust you only see in a person who's been let down by too many people who looked harmless. She didn't say thank you. She said, "I'm not going anywhere with you." "That's fine," Wade said. He held out the indenture paper to her. "This is yours. Burn it or keep it makes no difference to me." He turned and walked back toward the livery. She followed him because she had nowhere else to go. He let her walk beside him without saying anything for a stretch. He collected his horse, a red roan he called Casket, which tells you something about the man, and led it down to the water trough at the far end of the street. Della kept pace. "Why'd you do that?" she asked. "Seemed like the right price," he said. "That doesn't answer the question." He stopped and looked at her sideways. "No," he said, "it doesn't." He went back to watering the horse. They sat in the shade of the livery for the better part of an hour. The town went about its business around them, such as it was. A man drove a wagon past loaded with fence posts. 2 women walked by on the far side of the street and didn't look over. Nobody in Cordera was looking at anything they didn't have to look at. It was in that quiet that she told him about Junie. She told him the way people tell you the most important thing last, when they've used up all the smaller words. Her sister was 12 years old. Bidwell had sent her up to the road camp on the Rincon Wash 2 days before Wade arrived in town. The indenture papers covered both of them. By buying Della's contract, Wade had freed Della alone. Junie was still up there with Cutter Foss running the crew. She didn't ask him outright. She looked at him with those river gray eyes and said, "I know you don't owe me anything. I know you've already spent what little you had." I know whatever brought you to Cordera. It wasn't this." She stopped. Then, "But she's 12 years old." Wade was quiet a good long while after that. Long enough that a man who didn't know better might have figured he wasn't listening. He was staring at a loose board on the livery wall, working the edge of it with his thumb, his face gone still and flat in the way a man's face goes when he's carrying something heavy. He'd had a sister once. That was a thought he didn't let himself finish very often. "Tell me about the road camp," he said. He didn't say yes. He didn't say he'd do it. He just asked that question. Della, who was sharp enough to hear what it meant, told him everything she knew. "Now, partner, I want you to hold on to something before we go further. If you've ever been somewhere dark and clawed your way back toward daylight, if you've ever decided to put down a badge or a gun or a fight that was eating you alive just so you could breathe again, then you already know something about what it cost Wade Caro to ask that question." He had quit. Not the way a coward quits, but the way a man quits when he's given everything he had and watched the world swallow it without a word of thanks. 4 years riding circuit out of Yuma as the Ash Marshal, through country that would have broken most men in a month. He'd done that work until it broke him too, and then he'd walked away and spent 2 years trying to turn himself into somebody who didn't know how to draw a gun. $12. That was the sum total of what 2 years of trying had built him. And now this. Like and subscribe right here, friend, and drop us a comment. Where are you listening from tonight? What time is it where you are? We'll be right back to Cordera. They made camp that night in a dry wash 3 miles south of town, in the shadow of a saguaro stand so old it would have been there when Coronado came through, looking for cities of gold that didn't exist. The desert at night in October has a particular cold to it, sharp and clean, nothing like the damp cold further north. Della broke small branches for the fire while she talked. Busy hands. That's how you say things you can't say sitting still. The road camp had 20 workers. Some had come for the wages Bidwell advertised. Most had come the way Della had come, through indenture papers and a crooked judge and a debt that somehow never got any smaller no matter how many hours a man put in. Cutter Foss ran the whole operation out of a ledger book that tracked every worker, every hour, every dollar of outstanding debt. That ledger was the machinery behind everything Bidwell had built. Without it, the indenture contracts fell apart. Without it, the judge in Cordera had nothing to point to in court. "You want the ledger," Wade said. "I want my sister," Della said. "I understand that. But if we take the girl and leave everything else standing, you know what happens?" He fed a branch to the fire. "Bidwell builds another camp, finds another judge, finds another family with a dead father and a debt they can't clear." He looked at her across the fire. "I've seen how this works." "You sound like a lawman," Della said. "Used to be. What happened?" The fire crackled. Somewhere out to the west, a coyote tried the dark. Wade watched the coals and said, "The law ran out of road for a while. I ran out with it." Come morning, he rode up to a high point above the wash and spent 3 hours working a battered spyglass across the road camp. He counted the men, mapped the layout in his head the way he'd been trained to do. Cook fire, bunkhouse, or tent where a man like Foss would keep his records. 2 posted at the entrance road. Work crews heading out with picks and shovels, and the ones who couldn't keep pace getting pulled aside by Denny Foss. Then a small figure in a blue dress hauling water from the creek. Something moved in his chest that hadn't moved in a good long while. Vane was alive, unhurt far as he could tell. And Cutter Foss was a methodical man. Wade had already figured that from the way the camp ran. Methodical men keep regular hours and sleep in predictable places, which means you can plan around them. The camp itself sat in a natural choke point where the wash narrowed between two limestone walls, one road in, one road out. He came back down and told Della what he'd seen. Then he told her what he was going to do about it. "You're going in alone?" she said. "I'm going in ahead. You come in behind." "I don't have a gun." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a short-barreled Remington in a worn holster, held it out to her. "You do now." When she reached for it, he kept hold a moment. "This isn't decoration," he said. "If I tell you to use it, you use it without thinking about it. You hear me?" She took it. Her hand didn't shake. He noted that. He spent the afternoon walking her through loading, grip, breathing, the pause before the pull. She was a fast learner, the way people get fast at things when the lesson is tied directly to staying alive. By the time the sun dropped behind the rincons, she could hit a tin cup at 30 feet 3 times in 5, which was enough. "Stay behind the limestone shelf until you hear 2 whistles, he told her. "When you hear them, you come straight in and go straight to Junie. Nothing else. I'll take care of Foss." "What about the ledger?" "I'll take care of that too." "Wade." She said his name in a way that made him look at her properly. "Don't get yourself killed doing this." He almost smiled. It wasn't something his face did easily or often. "I'll do my best." He went in at 2 in the morning. That's the hour I've always thought God must have made for men with something to hide, or men who've come to take something back. The fires had burned down to coals. The stars were out in full force the way they only are in the high desert, so thick and close you feel like you could reach up and scatter them. Even the men supposed to be on watch had their chins dropping. He'd spent an hour just before dark scouting the base of the cliff on the west side of the camp, learning where he could put his feet without making noise. 3 low fires burning in the camp, enough light to navigate by without ruining anyone's night eyes. He moved through the sleeping work crews like water through a crack in stone, past the horses on the picket line, to the ore tent at the back near the cliff wall. He lifted the flap and stepped inside. Cutter Foss sat at his camp table with the ledger open, one finger resting on a column of numbers, a cup of cold coffee at his elbow. He looked up. Wade had the Colt leveled before Foss's hand moved 3 inches toward his hip. "We're going to be quiet," Wade said. Foss raised both hands slow. He was the kind of man who recalculated quickly. "You've made a mistake," he said. "Made several. This isn't one of them. Push the ledger to me." Foss pushed it. Wade tucked it inside his duster without dropping his eyes. "Junie Vane," he said. "Which tent?" "Nothing." "You heard me." "You'll never get out of this camp," Foss said. "You shoot me, Denny hears it. 7 armed men between you and that road." "I wasn't planning on shooting you," Wade said. "I was planning on tying you to that tent pole and walking out." He pulled a length of rope from his belt. "You start hollering, I'll reconsider. Your call." Foss looked at the rope, looked at the Colt, looked at the man holding both. "Second tent from the cook fire," he said. "The one with the torn canvas flap." Della was at the limestone shelf when Wade came around the western wall. He gave 2 low whistles and she came at a run. He pointed her toward the tent and followed 3 steps back, hand near the Colt, watching the camp. Junie was awake. Children in places like that don't really sleep. She looked up when Della pushed through the tent flap and made a sound that had no words in it. the sound of a child who had been counting the hours for days and had stopped trusting the count. Della had her arms around her before either of them said anything at all. They were moving toward the western cliff when Denny Foss stepped out of the dark between two cook fires with a rifle already at his shoulder. "Far enough," Denny said. That barking dog laugh was already building in his throat. "Cutter." He waited. Nothing from the ore tent. His eyes cut to Wade. "Who are you, Drifter?" Wade put himself between the rifle and the two girls. "You're pointing a gun at a child, friend. Think on that." "I'm pointing a gun at a thief. Cutter." "Your brother's fine. He's just tied up at the moment." The camp was stirring now, work crew coming awake, uncertain and scared. A few of Bidwell's gun hands were pulling themselves upright, hands drifting toward irons, trying to read the firelight. Wade read the scene the way he'd read 100 scenes before it. 6 guns in various states of ready. Denny Foss with a rifle already up. 1 Colt against all of it, and a woman behind him with a short Remington and a 12-year-old to protect. He'd stood in worse spots. "I want everyone to hear this," Wade said, loud enough to carry, but not loud enough to be a shout. He was talking to the whole camp now, gun hands and work crew both. "I have Royce Bidwell's ledger of indenture contracts." A murmur moved through the crew. He let it go quiet again. "Every man working a debt that never seems to shrink, your name is in here. Your terms are in here. When this reaches the Federal Marshal's office in Tucson, it's going to make very interesting reading." He looked at the gun hands. "You boys want to think about which side of that conversation you're standing on." 2 of them set their guns down. 1 took 2 steps back and sat on a rock and said quietly, "I got a family." Denny Foss had not moved his rifle an inch. Whatever had been behind his smiling was gone now, and what replaced it wasn't pleasant. "You're a dead man, Drifter." "Could be," Wade said. He could feel the colt heavy in his palm, feel that cold settling that came over him when everything narrowed down to a barrel and a held breath. "But not tonight." Denny pulled the trigger. The shot went wide. Not because Denny was a bad shot, but because in the half-second between the trigger pull and the sound, Della Vane raised the short Remington and fired. She hit Denny Foss in the right shoulder, high and clean, exactly where Wade had told her to aim. Denny went down like a man falling off his own certainty, which is essentially what he was. His rifle clattered on the red rock. The camp went the way camps go after a shot nobody expected, completely still for 1 long breath. Wade walked over to where Denny lay and picked up the rifle. He looked at what remained of the gun hands, 1 face at a time. Anybody else? Nobody was. The work crew was a different situation. They weren't going to fight, but they weren't in any shape to just stand up and walk out either. Some had come willingly, most hadn't. Wade told them all the same thing. The ledger was going to the Federal Marshal's office in Tucson, and anyone willing to come along and testify to what had happened in this camp was welcome to make that ride. 6 of them came. 1 was a man named Pratt who turned out to be a former territorial court clerk, which, as it happened, was exactly the kind of witness a federal prosecutor dreams about. Royce Bidwell was arrested in Cordera on October the 9th by 2 federal marshals out of Tucson. They'd been building a case against him for the better part of a year and hadn't had the piece they needed to close it. Pratt, the court clerk from the work camp, gave them that piece. The ledger gave them everything else. The crooked judge didn't wait to be collected. He wrote a letter of resignation and rode out of Cordera before sunrise, which is the coward's way of admitting what he was without ever having to say it out loud. Cutter Foss stood trial the following spring. 5 years. Denny got 3, on account of his shoulder and a lawyer who knew how to talk about suffering. Bidwell got 7, which everyone who'd spent time in that road camp considered generous. But that's what you get sometimes when a man can pay for the right words in court. The indenture papers were voided. Thomas Vane's 40 acres of bottomland reverted to Della and Junie Vane, free and clear. Wade Caro was gone from Cordera by the morning of October the 5th. He left before the sun was up, before Della woke, before Junie had finished sleeping the deep, untroubled sleep of a child who stopped being afraid. He left the Remington on the blanket beside Della. No note. He wasn't a note-writing man. But Della told me years later that she found in the pocket of the canvas duster he'd left hanging on the tent pole a single folded sheet of paper. The indenture contract for Della Vane, the one he'd bought off Bidwell's palm on the church steps. On the back of it, in small, careful handwriting that looked like it had once belonged to a man who did a lot of paperwork, he'd written 4 words. Consider the debt paid. That was all. No name, no direction. I asked Della once, years after that, when she was running the mercantile she'd built on her father's bottomland, and Junie was in school training to become a teacher, whether she'd ever found out what became of him. She thought on it a while, the way a person turns something over that they've already made their peace with. Then she said, I heard a name once from a freighter out of Yuma. Said there was a man called the Ash Marshal who'd come back on the circuit. Said he was riding again. She folded her hands on the counter. I don't know if it was him. I'm not sure I need to know. I think she got that right, friend. Some things belong to a man and to the horizon he rides toward. They don't need a witness. Now I'm getting old, and I've had a long time out here to think on what I saw in Cordera in the autumn of 1886. I've thought about Royce Bidwell with his careful smile and his legal papers that dressed cruelty up in arithmetic. I've thought about Della on those church steps in her mother's gray dress. About Junie hauling water in the dark with nobody coming. And I've thought mostly about Wade Caro on that livery fence with $12 and a road-worn duster, watching something happen that was none of his business at all. The world has always had too many Bidwells, men who figured out how to make the wrong thing look like paperwork. Men who learned that if you can write the contract and pay the judge, you never have to raise your voice about any of it. What the world comes up short on is the other kind. The kind who sits on a fence on a Tuesday morning, sees something terrible 20 feet away, and reaches into their pocket for whatever they've got left. $12. That's all it took to start the whole thing moving. I'll tell you something else, partner. A man who spent 2 years running from who he was could still show up when it mattered. Still ride back into the fire one more time when a 12-year-old girl needed somebody to come looking for her. Where you've been isn't the whole of you. A man's past can explain him without owning him. Wade Caro proved that on a Tuesday morning in October with the last $12 he had to his name. I've been carrying that one a long time. I hope it rides with you too. If these old stories still mean something to you, I'd be proud to have you back on the trail. Like this one, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're listening from tonight. What time is it where you are? Which stories stayed with you the longest? We'll be out here waiting. Keep your powder dry, friend, and your soul honest. This is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and events are entirely invented. The Arizona Territory and the people who built their lives there deserve honest telling. This story tries to honor the spirit of that world while being what it is. A tale told by firelight, with a little help from artificial intelligence and a whole lot of love for the frontier, until our trails cross again.